Hey there, everybody, it's me, your buddy Dave, the host here at The Dark Stuff, jumping on a thread that's going around. I've seen it a couple of different ways. I initially saw it over at Lost Mixtapes, and he did 10 albums that changed my life. He was basing it on people who did, one person did 12, one person did 20. I was initially going to do 10, but I've actually come up with 13. So this video is the 13 albums that changed my life. Clarify, I'm only going to do albums that were new releases at the time that I, discovered them. So in other words, you're not going to see me talking about like the Beatles' White Album because that came out before I was born. So that's kind of where we're coming from. I was born in 1971. So most of these records are from like 1980 to the early 90s in that period. So I'm going to do these chronologically. Okay. So there's not a ranking. There's just this is when they came out. This one came out in July of 1980, AC/DC Back in Black. Now, all of you guys know this record. It's the 6th biggest selling album in the history of music. But for me, growing up, AC/DC was a band that really caught my attention when I first started getting into rock. Now, growing up, my parents were not music listeners around the house very much. My dad liked classical music. My mom liked whatever was on the radio. She had some tapes, Barry Manilow and Barbra Streisand. So there wasn't any music to look to inside of my house. I was the oldest, so I didn't have an older sibling or anything to look to, or any cousins or whatever. So all of this music that I discovered was 100% from the radio. Okay. I was a child of the radio, and it started off with AM radio, and then eventually I got into FM and started listening to Z92, which was the rock station. So when Back in Black came out and I started hearing it on the radio, I was so young, I was 9. I don't think I even realized there was a new singer. Honestly, I don't think I understood that. I just was like, this is AC/DC, it's awesome. Started me down a path of hard rock listening that remained for a long time. I mean, I still love AC/DC to this day. That album, sure, I've heard it 50,000 times, but it is still so good. So it absolutely changed my life. Okay, the next one. This one came out in March of 1981. It's The Who, Face Dances. Okay, the band's first album of the 1980s. And this happens to be the first album that I bought with my own money. Don't ask me how I earned any money when I was 10, but I definitely remember that this was the record I paid for with my own money. You Better You Bet had been on the radio, and I used to hear it all the time, and I loved that song, and I went to the store, and I bought the 7-inch for You Better You Bet. But that 7-inch had the radio edit, and I, at 10 years old, didn't understand the concept of radio edit. So when I ended up getting Face Dances, and I heard this extra verse that was in the song and these little extra parts, I was like blown away. I just, the concept was completely foreign to me. Okay, I mean, I know Face Dances isn't considered one of the Who's best records. I don't care. I love it, and I still love it to this day. It made a massive connection with me, especially You Better You Bet. But I mean, also songs like Don't Let Go of the Coat, Did You Steal My Money, How Can You Do It Alone, Daily Records, all of it was really good. So anyways, that was what got me into The Who, and of course I had heard stuff on the radio. I then went backwards and got a lot of the 70s records, but that record will always mean a lot to me because it was my first one. All right, next up, this is number 3 if we're keeping score. Missing Persons, Spring Session M. This came out in October of 1982, and this album rocked my little 12-year-old world. I heard Spring Session M, or the Missing Persons, on the radio. They did play the song Words and Walking in LA on Z92, the radio station I listened to in Omaha. But when I saw Missing Persons for the first time on television, and I don't know whether it was like Solid Gold or like on USA Network, Night Flight, or somewhere along the line, I saw Missing Persons for the first time, and it took it to a whole other level. Now, I'm not going to get explicit here and tell you what's going on in the mind of a 12 to 13-year-old boy, but a lot of stuff is going on at that time. And Dale Bazio was somebody who helped me realize a lot of stuff. That's all I'm going to say. She was just so unique looking and so sexy and had this awesome voice, and it was weird and it was different, and she wore these clothes that were like super revealing, and we heard all these rumors that she was in Playboy and all of this, and I don't really know whatever happened with that, if she was or wasn't, but she just had something back then, and she wore these little like this clear plastic bra and stuff, and it was always an effort, like when, you know, to try to like see if you could see anything or whatever. But also the band is just, they're amazing musicians. They write really good lyrics. They're very unique and interesting. And although Missing Persons did go on for 2 more albums that were really good as well, they never touched this one because this one had the more acoustic drums and the more of a rock sound, whereas they got more into electronic music and the second 2. But man, Missing Persons, Spring Session M, amazing, massive impact on my life. Okay, number 4 and 5, they both came out within a week of each other. First one we're going to do is Kiss, Lick It Up. Okay. Not much to look at on the back, just the songs. So Kiss, Lick It Up. I had been becoming a Kiss fan. I was 12 at that time. But that was the first new release where it's actually the record where I became obsessed with Kiss. I went from being a moderate fan to just complete and total obsession. Within a year, I started my own fanzine. I was going to shows. I was just absolutely, I bought every single tape. I was buying tapes back then, but I bought all the tapes that they had up until that point, except for maybe, I don't think I bought The Elder and Unmasked at that point. I think I waited for a while on those, but that's a side note. I was starting to get into hard rock and heavy metal like big time. AC/DC was maybe the catalyst, but there were lots of others that I was listening to on the radio. Kiss was not on the radio, but when I connected with Kiss Lick It Up, it was because they were on MTV, and MTV did embrace this new Kiss because it was something different. They took the makeup off and people were paying more attention to them. So I definitely did. I saw all the videos, and although they seem pretty cheesy now, they were like mind-blowing to me back in 1983. And it started me on a lifelong quest of just being a Kiss fan, still to this day. I mean, I did a video just a few months ago celebrating 40 years of being a fan, and then other was, you know, my thoughts on the band ending after 50 years and whatever. But yeah, it all really started with Lick It Up. And how's it hold up today? I think pretty well, actually, because this is another album. This is before they started bringing in a lot of outside writers, so it was still the Kiss guys and writing the record themselves. So I think it's great. I mean, Not for the Innocent is killer. Exciter, Lick It Up, Young and Wasted, A Million to One is awesome, and On the Eighth Day. I mean, the whole thing is great. Kiss, Lick It Up. Okay, a week later, this album came out, Mötley Crüe, Shout at the Devil. Mötley Crüe is a discovery of mine through MTV, seeing the Looks That Kill video, and my mind was blown. Now, you could see that Mötley Crüe had a certain Kiss influence and Alice Cooper influence. I hadn't really discovered Alice Cooper at that point. But they were like harder and edgier and just wilder, it seemed, than Kiss was at that time, you know? They were like, they took it up a couple of notches. My Mötley Crüe fandom really is about the first 2 albums. I love this one, and I love Too Fast for Love. Beyond that, a couple of songs, but really, I think creatively they were already spent after this album. But this album is a solid, pretty much 10 out of 10. I love it. I love the production. I like all the songs. I like even Nikki Sixx's lyrics are interesting and not dumb. You know, I'm Jewish, and I did have a bar mitzvah when I was a kid. It's something Jewish people do when they're 13, right? So in spring of 1984, I had my bar mitzvah, and when my parents were trying to arrange a DJ or whatever for the party, I told them, you need to tell the DJ that they have to have Looks That Kill by Mötley Crüe to play at my party. Otherwise, screw them. They can't come. And they actually did. And Mötley Crüe, Looks That Kill, was played at my party. Next up is the Bangles, All Over the Place. This one came out in spring of 1984. I was 13. As we just established, I was becoming a pretty big hard rock fan. So it was Kiss and Mötley Crüe and Van Halen and Rat had come out by this point, and all these other bands, and I was loving most of them, okay? But when I saw the Bangles on TV for the first time, and it was their Hero Takes a Fall video, something happened. Okay, something maybe a little similar to what happened with Dale Bozzio for Missing Persons, but I was 2-3 years older now. I was a little more sophisticated. But yeah, I did definitely sort of fixate and become borderline infatuated with Susanna Hoffs. Okay, she's just stunning looking, and there's no point in avoiding that scenario. But what I always tell people is, if Susanna Hoffs and the Bangles music weren't like amazing, weren't really, really good, why would I care 40 years later? Right? Like, it wouldn't make any difference to me about some woman that was hot 40 years ago. Who gives a shit, right? But because this album is so amazing, and I've done videos just on this album by itself, it absolutely changed my life. Because from this, it opened my mind to other types of music that were current, that were going on. So maybe groups like REM, or groups like, ultimately the Replacements and some other bands that came along later, that my mind was open because I started listening to the Bangles. So on the Bangles' next album after this, they covered Alex Chilton. That was in 1985. Most people credit the Replacement song Alex Chilton from 1987 as being, people my age anyways, as being their catalyst for looking into Chilton and getting into Big Star and such like that. But truth be told, for me, it was the Bangles. All over the place. Absolutely changed my life. Okay, next up, this one came out in 1987. Here's the CD, and then I also have the box set for it, which came out a couple years ago. The Replacements, Pleased to Meet Me, wasn't the first time I heard the Replacements, but it was their first new album that I picked up, and it really, again, for me, kicked off the complete obsession. Now, my introduction to the Replacements was by going into Homer's record store in Omaha, and they were playing the Let It Be album from 1984, a couple years before that. And I was a huge Kiss fan, as we just established, and their cover of Black Diamond came on the loudspeaker. And I was in the store to probably buy, who knows, something by like Poison or Bullet Boys or some shit. But I heard that, and it was like, perked up my ear. I was like, this is interesting. This new band I've never heard of covering Kiss. So I bought it, sight unseen, or just hearing the one song, took it home, didn't really like it. Okay, it just wasn't what I thought it was going to be. Gradually, over time, grew to love it. And then when the band's next album, when Pleased to Meet Me came out in 87, I bought it right away. All my friends and I, that summer of 87, because we all got our driver's licenses and all of this stuff because I was 16, we would go into these undeveloped neighborhoods where they just done the concrete, but there was no houses there, but just the carve out of the neighborhood. And we would go there and drink and do whatever teenagers do and listen to Rolling Stones, Pleased to Meet Me, Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction, any Rolling Stones album, and maybe some others like Rush or whatever. But it was such a huge thing of my year of being 16. And again, the Replacements are, next to Kiss, probably my favorite band of all time. And my obsession was kicked off with Pleased to Meet Me, which means it 100% changed my life. Okay, my next selection in the 13 albums that changed my life is actually a compilation. It's called Ramones Mania. This came out in 1988. I actually have it on CD as well. But that was my introduction to the Ramones. I'd heard the name and everything, and I probably saw some videos on MTV. I'm sure I saw like Psychotherapy or whatever, some of the early 80s videos, because I did watch MTV a lot. But they were just sort of like a band that I didn't, connect with yet. A buddy of mine and I, back in 87 or so, started our own little music fanzine, mostly about hard rock and heavy metal and stuff. But we got put on all these lists, and so publicists would just send tons of records, all sorts of shit, whether it was metal or not. And one of those records was Ramones Mania, and I put it on, and it changed my fucking life just immediately. I mean, side one is I Want to Be Sedated, Teenage Lobotomy, Do You Remember Rock and Roll Radio, Gimme Gimme Shock Treatment, Beat on the Brat, Sheena's a Punk Rocker, I Want to Live, Pinhead. That's just side one. Okay, so it has all the best songs up to about 1988. So it has like Bonzo Goes to Bitburg and Outsider and We Want the Airwaves, Somebody Put Something in My Drink, you know, all of the 80s stuff up to a certain point. And man, I became a fan of them. And then I started seeing all these other bands who were like inspired by the Ramones. And so that went, you know, I'd check out those bands and whatever. And yeah, it was kind of the path where I specifically identified with punk rock. Okay. I'd liked stuff that was maybe punk before, but like that was a band that identified as punk. And I was like, I'm into this. I want more. Okay, about a month later in 1988, this album changed my life in innumerable ways. It's Public Enemy. It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. It's their second album. Came out on Def Jam Recordings in 1988. Most people know it because it does have Bring the Noise, which later they did with Anthrax. But man, I've talked about this album on a couple of other videos. Like, hip-hop to me was still pretty new in 1987. I was 16. I knew the Beastie Boys. I knew Run DMC. I knew Big Daddy Kane. I knew a couple of the biggest names. But it was still very much a segregated music form, and it was still very much, that's black music, right? And white people were not really getting into rap that much yet. Obviously, that changed a lot in the 80s or in the late 80s into the 90s. This album, you know, Chuck D describes Public Enemy a lot back then. He used to describe it as CNN for black people, and it was like that for me too. I learned a ton of stuff. I mean, a lot of names of prominent civil rights leaders and Black Panther leaders and things like that, you know, weren't taught in school in suburban Omaha, you know, and not because they were trying to keep you from, you know, hearing it, but it's just like that you just didn't learn that stuff back when I was growing up. Even though Malcolm X technically was born here in Omaha, and there's a little Malcolm X Center up in North O that I've actually been to twice, just FYI. So while Chuck D still remains my favorite MC of all time, probably, I don't see how that will ever be changed. What's also interesting about this album and what changed my view, changed my world, was the music, because it was so intense and had like these just heavier beats. It had like sirens and crazy noises and like all this stuff going on at the same time as the music. And there was this intensity of the delivery of Chuck D, both with the music from the Bomb Squad. That's what they were called, the DJs or the guys who made the music back then. It makes it so that you cannot passively listen to Public Enemy. It's not something you can put on in the background, chill out, and do something else. It pulls you in. It demands your attention. And that's what really, really affected me. And it made it so like normal rap just didn't do it. You had to have a little bit of kick there. You had to have some intensity to you. Otherwise, you're just boring. Otherwise, you're skilo, you know? This album changed my fucking life. Still the best PE album, in my opinion. Okay, next up, also in 1988, Jane's Addiction, Nothing Shocking. Jane's Addiction, Nothing Shocking came out at the end of the summer of 1988. And I got into it probably early 89 when I first heard Mountain Song. Again, it was through MTV because radio in Omaha was starting to get really, really bad and was not playing any new rock. I mean, they were very, very much stuck in the past. And, you know, if Kansas had a new record, they'd play that. But they weren't going to play Jane's Addiction or any of that stuff. That just was a non-starter. Wild and just completely crazy imagery. The insanely high-level musicianship of the three members of the band that play. You know, Perkins and Eric Avery and Navarro. And then Perry Farrell and the way he used his voice. And I didn't even understand like what was being done. But I mean, it was just so crazy. And the lyrics were just so unique and so special. And they just didn't sound like anyone else. And they made this band so unique. And when I went off to college, I was in an English class and we had to do a project of some sort where we were going to play a song and dissect the lyrics and talk about it and stuff. And I, of course, to be provocative, I chose Ted Just Admit It, which is on the B-side. And it's basically a song about the serial killer, Ted Bundy. And it's pretty gross. And the chorus is going, sex is violence, you know. So it was awkward playing it in class, but I got a lot of weird looks, and I don't think I made a lot of friends in that class at that time. But either way, this album was seminal, and then the next album was amazing, and then they formed Lollapalooza, and that was such a decade-defining music festival. And, you know, this was the album of the 90s, but it came out in 1988. Like, they defined a lot of what was special about the 90s, my favorite decade, but they did it years ahead of time. So that has the unique bonus of being massively influential while also at the same time just being just life-affirming and incredible the way they play. Bob Mould, Workbook. Bob's debut solo album from 1989. I was 18 in 1989, and I'd been hearing rumblings about Husker Du. The name was out there. I definitely heard the name. I'd been given a tape from a friend of mine, which was like a best of Husker Du, and that was how I discovered Husker Du, and I was just starting to discover them, but they had just broken up. And point of fact, Husker Du's final show of their warehouse tour of 1987 was supposed to be in Omaha at a place called the Ranch Bowl. However, the night before, they had played in Columbia, Missouri. The show was apparently a disaster, and Bob Mould didn't want to play the Omaha show, and they drove back to the Twin Cities after that. So Columbia, Missouri became the final show. Omaha would have been. Years later, when I met Bob Mould, I actually mentioned that to him, and I said, yeah, I was maybe going to go see that show, and he's like, oh, it would have been terrible. We were just terrible. And I said, you know what? I probably wouldn't have noticed the difference. When I was 16, I wouldn't have. I think for me with Workbook, this was the time where I really started to become focused on lyrics. Okay? I knew what they were before. Obviously, I paid attention to song lyrics and stuff, of course. But I really started to, like, delve into what they mean, and does this have a secret meaning, and is this sort of about this or secretly about that, or what's this metaphor about, or whatever. And it sent me on a path. I've been on that path for a long time. I do care a lot about lyrics. It's funny when I hear people say about songs or music or whatever, like, I don't even care about the lyrics. It's like, really? You don't? How do you? I mean, I'm not a musician. I don't know what chords he's playing, right? So I relate to stuff a lot by lyrics and melody and such. It was almost like Bob knew that he had, you know, influenced all of these other bands that were starting to emerge. So he decided to do something totally different. He became very influenced by Richard Thompson and did an album that is very Richard Thompson-esque, probably unintentionally. There's a funny anecdote in his book, in Mould's biography, where he says he brought the guys of Soul Asylum up to his house before this album had come out, and he played it for them because he wanted to get their opinion because he was friends with them. And Dave Pirner said something like, hey, have you ever heard of a guy named Richard Thompson? Kind of funny. Anyways, brilliant album. It absolutely. And then I went and bought every Husker Du album, and I bought every Grant Hart or Bob Mould related release ever since then, thanks to this. Okay, the 12th one is Sonic Youth, Goo. This came out in 1990. This was the first new release of Sonic Youths that I had heard. Again, it was sort of similar to some others where I'd heard the name, kind of like with Husker Du, but I couldn't associate a song. I don't think when I was listening to this early on, I really understood exactly like how special this album is and the way in which it set about like everything to come in my kind of music from the 90s. So the term alternative music had just been sort of thrown out there surrounding this because they didn't want to call it, I guess, punk or new wave or whatever anymore. They needed a new marketing term. So this is alternative. And if you know anything about the origins of what happened with Geffen Records and with Nirvana, you'll know that Sonic Youth laid the groundwork for it to be okay for Nirvana to sign to a major label, and then of course they changed the world with Nevermind the following year. And while Nevermind did in fact change the world, I mean, this might have been one of the early catalysts that made it possible. I mean, I would definitely say. And the album, just with the way that they tuned their guitars, with the odd tunings and the weird sounds, and just and Kim Gordon's sort of non-traditional way of singing, and Lee Ranaldo with his kind of spacey, like borderline Grateful Dead-y kind of tunes, and then you have Thurston, who's always the more melodic guy in the band, and his songs would be like the catchiest. And so you still have that abrasiveness and catchiness, you know, kind of like Dirty Boots. Yeah, so anyways, this album is just fantastic. Okay, and the final one is FIREHOSE, Flyin the Flannel. Okay, this was their album from the spring of 1991, actually released on April 23rd, 1991, the same day that Johnny Thunders died. One of my all-time musical idols, in fact, I'm wearing a shirt right now, is Mike Watt. And I had heard, again, FIREHOSE a little bit beforehand from the From Ohio record, but I didn't have it. And this was the first FIREHOSE album that I actually owned. I saw them open for the Feelies at the Barrymore Theater in Madison, and they were just absolutely incredible. And it started me on this Watt path, because of course then I went and bought the older FIREHOSE records, and I do like Ragin' Full On and If'n, better than this one. But then that got me to go backwards to the Minutemen. I got Double Nickels on the Dime, and all of the great Minutemen stuff. So the musicianship from Mike Watt and George Hurley. I think that Ed from Ohio, Ed Crawford, had a great voice, and his take on doing things was very different than D. Boon, and that was a huge distinction. That's why 2/3 of the band could be the same, and they could sound so incredibly different. I really liked the lyrical approach from Watt. Watt started inserting a lot of personal politics and things into songs and addressing ideas that again, I was hearing about for the first time. Most notably, I would say the song Anti-Misogyny Maneuver on this record. Really just focusing in on how much misogyny is in the music business and in even in the punk rock scene and stuff. So it's still there. So it makes you kind of aware of it. Also learned about Daniel Johnston from this record because of their cover of Walking the Cow. That became pretty interesting. A lot of people credit Kurt Cobain because he used to wear that "Hi, how are you" shirt. True, okay, that got a lot of people to buy his shirt. But this one got me to look into who the hell Daniel Johnston actually was. Okay, folks, those are my 13. Go ahead and make your 13 or your 12 or your 10 or whatever else you feel like doing of the albums that changed your life. Thanks a lot for watching, everybody. Take care.
So, you have a MySpace page or something?